Welcome to Doctorates of the Absurd, your provider of belief on demand. Rome didn't collapse because of barbarian invasions. It collapsed because its own citizens abandoned its cities and started dancing in the fields. Okay, so let's unpack this. We've got a stack of sources here. And, well, they're not just historical records. They feel more like a philosophical grenade lobbed at the whole idea of the state.
That's a good way to put it.
Our deep dive today is a really radical look at what happens when an entire civilization, collectively decides its government is an abomination. It completely reframes the collapse of the Roman Empire.
It does. It moves it away from a military defeat and reframes it as a mass philosophical and spiritual withdrawal done by its own people.
This is a really rigorous narrative we're looking at. It's focused entirely on the drama of ideas, not the drama of armies, which is what we usually get.
Exactly. Our mission here is to deconstruct this concept of the Leviathan, this colossal artificial state, and really examine the internal fire that was used to melt it from the inside out.
Right.
The sources are giving us this just devastating critique of power. They're basically suggesting that the decline of a state like this is predetermined. It's inevitable once the people see the machine for what it is.
And it gets to the existential itch, doesn't it? The core tension here is something I think we all feel. How do you find meaning? How do you live a genuine life when you feel trapped inside this huge artificial machine?
The state, the empire, the institution.
Exactly. A machine that just thrives on abstraction and control and, well, deceit.
That tension is everything. And the villain in this story, according to our sources, is the abomination itself.
The Leviathan.
The Leviathan. The state, with Rome as its, poster child, and it's what the text calls architecture of massacre.
And it has to use these, what are they called, mantles of light?
Yes, mantles of light, to hide its ruthless mechanical core. And the stakes couldn't be higher. If we ignore what the authors call the signs of the times, we become dead souls.
Meaning what exactly?
We lose all authentic connection to life, to nature, to community. We sacrifice our living existence to this monumental emptiness. The moment we stop seeing the abomination and see the machine, that's when it all starts to crumble.
And that's what we're here to figure out. How an entire population, centuries before the official collapse, saw past that facade and just walked away.
So to really expose the Leviathan, we first have to understand the foundational lie, the one that all these big power structures rely on.
The big lie.
The big lie. And what's so fascinating in the text is its assertion that that power must lie. It has to adopt an ideological cover story.
It has to hide the machinery.
It has to hide the machinery. The bureaucracy, the resource extraction, the military, all of that has to be cloaked in something spiritual or divine or, glorious.
So this is the mantle of light.
That's the term.
It's like the ultimate PR move, this glorious spiritual story to hide the cold mechanical core, the brand management for an empire.
Yes, exactly. An empire that cannot afford to look like, just a giant accounting operation with swords. And the sources are clear. This isn't just a Roman thing.
No.
Look at the parallels they give us. The Persian king, he covers himself with the mantle of light of Ahura Mazda. He claims to be the living embodiment of divine truth. So his rule is just. It's inevitable.
And then later,
the sources suggest that the emerging Christian church does something similar. It sort of co-ops and covers itself with the mantle of the reborn Osiris, taking these ancient beloved cycles of rebirth and redemption.
And using them to justify a new monolithic centralized structure of its own.
Precisely. And the consequence of this necessary lie is just constant performance, constant paranoia.
Right, because the mask could slip.
The mask could slip. The sources say both have to lie continually to deny that they've put the mantles over machinery and to keep the mantles from slipping off.
It's endless ideological maintenance.
It is, because the second the public realizes they're not obeying a divine mandate, but like a logistics spreadsheet.
Right. The authority just vanishes.
Yeah.
Nobody worships the tax code.
Exactly. And this leads us to probably the most counterintuitive piece of analysis in our material. We're all taught, by traditional historians, to see the reign of Octavian Augustus.
The first emperor, the Pax Romana, the Golden Age.
The glorious dawn of the empire. But the text argues it was actually dusk.
Okay, I want to stop on that. Augustus being dusk. That goes against everything. What's the mechanism in the text that suggests this profound decline began precisely when Rome was supposedly at its peak?
Well, the sources suggest that by the time Augustus consolidates power and, formally ends the Republic,
right,
which was chaotic, but at least sometimes organic,
right,
By that point, the fourth beast, the beast with great iron teeth and 10 horns, had already devoured the earth. Augustus didn't create the state machine, he just perfected it. He made it systematic, bureaucratic, permanent.
The Pax Romana was just the silence of a well-oiled machine.
A fully operational death machine settling into its groove, yes. The Republic, for all its massive flaws, still had this pretense of what the text calls bound freedom.
Okay, another key term. Bound freedom.
Freedom that's constrained by shared law, by tradition. The empire under Augustus it removed those last few inconvenient philosophical restraints. It traded a messy, sometimes living freedom for a very clean, systematic order.
So the real tragedy, the moment of spiritual doom, wasn't when Rome was weak. It was when it was strongest, most stable, most ordered.
Yes.
And that brings us back to that challenge in the text. "O ye hypocrites, ye discern the face of the sky, but can ye not discern the signs of the times?" We're conditioned to misinterpret the signs. We see huge centralized power and think, oh, prosperity.
And that misinterpretation extends directly to the physical world Rome was building. What we're taught to see as great architectural beauty, the source material forces us to see as just horror.
You're talking about the monuments, the temples.
Think of Rome's monumental public works. The massive copies of shrines and temples they built across all the provinces, usually with the spoils of conquest.
They were designed to scream permanence, piety. Rome is supreme. But the text argues that these copies, like the ones nominally for Ceres Demeter, the goddess of grain,
they were absolutely empty. They had the form of spiritual meaning, but none of the content. They kept the facade, the mantle of light, but they were serving a new, monolithic, mechanical master.
How so? I mean, how is the original spirit different?
Well, the original living spirit of the Earth Mother, Cybele, and her daughter Demeter, that spirit is about seasonal cycles, ecological life. It's fundamentally opposed to the Roman system, which is all about consumption, appropriation, and massive centralized control.
To understand the profanity of it, we have to look at the function, right? The original worship, it involved what? Ecstatic dances, rituals.
Yes, things that linked people directly to the soil, to the natural cycles of death and rebirth. Rome just copied the look of the temples, but the purpose was totally different.
They weren't shrines to life anymore.
They became colossal monuments to colossal massacres, a permanent architectural celebration of the human sacrifice required to feed the legions and the cities.
The Roman triumph is the clearest example of that.
Absolutely. It was a spectacle. It was designed to show total subjugation, total destruction of life, and then the appropriation of all resources for the state.
And the arches and temples become these silent, permanent witnesses to that violence. The architecture is literally disguising death and slavery with this veneer of culture and imperial might.
And that, the sources insist, is the very definition of the abomination.
And the people on the ground. They felt this emptiness long before any historian would say the empire was in trouble. This spiritual vacuum, it manifested physically, right, in the cities themselves.
Yes, the specific detail in the sources is that the plazas, the public squares in front of these rising monuments, they were becoming desolate.
People just stopped going.
The living people were withdrawing their attention, their labor, and eventually their physical presence. The only ones left were those the text calls dead souls, the people totally invested in the state machine, and, well, those who were lured by the bribes and circuses.
And bread and circuses.
The state-sponsored distractions. So this desertion of the center, the literal abandonment of the public square, that's the first real sociological sign of an internal collapse.
That's fascinating. So the first act of resistance wasn't a battle. It was architectural. It was sociological. Rome is building these huge, intimidating monuments to its own power, and the people are just silently voting with their feet by not showing up.
They sense it. Without anyone needing to write a manifesto, they sense that the system is spiritually bankrupt. Their physical withdrawal is the first stage. It proves the mantle of light, the great lie, has already been exposed.
Which brings us to the engine room of this resistance, the how, the desolation of the plazas, this philosophical lie. It all leads to the mechanism of resistance, and that is this core binary the argument hinges on.
Yes, the profound distinction between artificial freedom and bound freedom.
Okay, we need to spend some real time here, because this is the philosophical core of the collapse.
Yeah.
What's the difference? What are the constraints, or lack of them, on these two kinds of freedom?
Well, bound freedom is the freedom that belongs to living things. to nature, to a community. It recognizes limits, dependencies, reciprocity. It is the freedom to live within reality.
Like a farmer.
A farmer is a perfect example. A farmer is free to plant his seeds, but he is bound by the seasons, by the nature of the soil. That dependency, that is life.
Okay, so then artificial freedom is the opposite.
It's the untethered, absolute, arbitrary power that the Leviathan claims for itself. The emperor, all abstract systems. It's the freedom to define your own reality, completely divorced from nature and from human constraint.
And the hidden mechanism here is kind of terrifying.
Yeah.
Artificial freedom, because it's so unbound, it inevitably leads to self-destructive irrationality.
And the rapid decomposition of the whole structure. Yes. If you can define your own reality without any consequences, eventually you will define a reality that just kills you and everyone around you.
Whereas true, lasting life, according to the text, is only possible if you cast off the armor.
Cast off the armor, the physical and philosophical constraints of the state. You have to return to sharing, to natural cycles. The minute the center of power defines its own arbitrary reality, it loses the ability to sustain the natural reality of its people, and you get this huge philosophical split.
But the resistance, it doesn't attack the machine from the outside. That's the key. It works from within.
It's an internal immunological response. The sources describe the fire that will burn down the Leviathan as stolen fire. It's the life force that, once it's trapped inside the monster, tries to burn their way out.
And the resistors are not some external army. They're insiders. Many, but not all, are Zeks.
And we should clarify Zeks. It's used here to mean captives, forced laborers, anyone trapped in mandatory duties. The people whose energy is being systematically extracted by the machine.
Their power comes from reclaiming meaning while they're still inside the belly of the beast.
Yes, from realizing that the machine's entire operation depends on their coerced but ultimately voluntary cooperation.
And the villain is so clearly defined. The Leviathan is this massive artificial state machine. It devours life. It thrives on lies and extraction. And the quote that just sticks with me, the thing that drove their strategy.
Rome reveals all of Leviathan's qualities, and none are preparing to walk into a fifth beast's jaws.
They knew. They recognized that just blowing up the Roman Leviathan with an army would just lead to a new one being built in its place.
The cycle would just continue.
This is where I want to focus on just how radical their strategy was. The sources call it a generalized resistance with revolutionary overtones. Now, withdrawal, that sounds so passive, but the text frames it as revolutionary. Why? I mean, doesn't just withdrawing risk letting the Leviathan just linger like that loose funnel-shaped carcass it talks about?
See, that's the profound philosophical leap they made. Withdrawal here is not passive flight at all. It's an active, structural decoupling.
Decoupling.
It's revolutionary because it targets the Leviathan's most critical energy source: human compliance, human labor, adherence to state definitions of property. It's a mass internal decoupling from the state's economic and ideological grid.
It's starving it.
It leads to its functional starvation. Yes.
Okay, give us some tangible examples of this.
Yeah.
How does an average person, a farmer or a laborer, actually do this revolution?
It was mostly economic sabotage through non-participation. Peasants would leave their fields untilled, or they'd just refuse to gather any harvest that was more than what they needed to survive.
And the point of that was?
To keep that surplus food from the Roman tax gatherers, the publicani, they literally chose bare survival and self-sufficiency over feeding the state apparatus. And you have to understand, that was an existential threat to the centralized grain supply that kept the cities passive.
So instead of fighting the taxman with a pitchfork, you just don't grow the taxable grain in the first place. That's brilliant.
It's the ultimate non-violent economic resistance. But there were other forms. You had urban populations moving to the country, just abandoning the official, empty civic life. And most visibly, soldiers.
The core of the machine.
The operational core of Leviathan. They deserted in huge numbers. They just dropped their armor and left their garrisons, choosing an uncertain life of freedom in small communities over the oppressive, meaningless discipline of the machine.
And the Essenes are mentioned too.
The Essenes, the Jewish dropouts cited in the text, they perfectly illustrate this spiritual withdrawal. They just stayed away from both the Roman and the Judean burdens.
So we have to contrast this with the Exodus from Egypt. The sources draw a really strong line here.
Yeah.
Why was this internal collapse so different from just, running into the desert?
Well, the early Israelites, they thought they were going to a physical place, a geographical location outside the beast's reach.
A promised land.
A promised land. These new resistors, they understood something deeper. They understood that the fourth beast had already devoured the whole earth. There was no outside left to run to. Running into the desert is pointless if you're still carrying the philosophy of the state inside your own head.
And what was that philosophical armor they had to shed internally?
The philosophy of the state, according to the sources, is the structure of domination, of abstraction, of imposing a single hierarchical law. Moses' followers, the critique goes, they carried the armor of the Egyptian state, of the Babylonian Lugal-Zabizi, with them. They were just trying to replace one master with another.
And the result was just a new Leviathan.
A new Leviathan, a new structure of domination, symbolized by the intolerance and the centralized authority that was later enforced by figures like Ezra.
But the Roman resistors, they were removing their armor, internal and external, before the main event. They were trying to break the cycle.
Exactly. They recognized that taking off the physical armor, deserting the legion, it meant nothing if you didn't also take off the internalized structure of domination. The goal was not a new state. The goal was to spontaneously generate a living community, right here, right now, free of that imposed structure.
They were generating the kingdom at hand.
That's it. They were already living in it.
And this internal liberation, it finds this physical and spiritual outlet. And it's in the resurgence of these ancient organic traditions, specifically the worship of the Earth Mother.
Yes, and the sources point us to the most oppressed people in the whole empire to see where it starts. The emaciated beggars of the Nile. People who have been systematically plundered for centuries, first by Persians, then Greeks, then Romans.
These were the people whose fields were the breadbasket of the empire.
And yet they themselves were completely destitute. As we said, they'd often just let their fields turn back to sand rather than produce a surplus for Rome's abstraction engine.
And yet, even though they're physically depleted, they find the power for this incredible action. The sources call it a superhuman feat.
They do. They rush into their Romanized temples to protect their dead gods. They carry Isis, Osiris, and Serapis out of that stifling monumental architecture into the fresh air for the first time in generations.
And then they dance.
They begin to dance, and the sources really emphasize this. It's an act of pure physical, spiritual affirmation. They stop feeling the exhaustion, the misery. The dance itself gives them strength. It makes them feel weightless and free.
And the power of this ecstatic joy, it's so strong it just breaks through the empire's core structure.
Yeah.
The army.
Roman soldiers, weighed down by their literal and symbolic armor, the oppressive discipline of the Leviathan, they just rush out of their posts, drop their weapons, and join the dancing. They start carrying these deities themselves to North Africa, to Gaul, Italy, the British Isles.
It's a movement of spontaneous spiritual recognition. It just jumps across geography and language.
And Isis isn't seen as some foreign cult when she arrives in these places. She's recognized instantly, everywhere, as the abandoned and betrayed earth. She's Cybele in Anatolia, Demeter in Greece. She's the soil, she's the grain.
She represents the living connection that the Roman machine tried to sever. In Italy, Isis is Ceres, right? The source of our word cereal.
Yes, but the text points out that we are now trained to think farmers or agricultural zecs make the grain. Some of us will think machines make it. We've totally lost that fundamental, living, spiritual connection to the source of life. We've replaced it with the abstraction of commodity and production quotas.
And her male counterpart, Osiris.
Osiris, or Serapis, he symbolizes the cycle, the necessary death and renewal that is inherent in nature. He's recognized across the empire as the Babylonian Tammuz, the Anatolian Attis, the Greek Adonis, all symbols of vegetation that has to go underground to rise again, just like Persephone.
So affirming the natural cycle of death and rebirth becomes the central spiritual act.
It's a direct contradiction to the centralized death cult architecture of Rome. The sources claim the dancers felt this vanished strength returning to them, a strength that would vanquish all of Rome's legions because they were affirming life itself. And that's a concept the Leviathan, built on abstraction. It can't comprehend it. It can only consume it.
And this resistance wasn't just in civilian cults. The soldiers, they found their own spiritual counterforce.
They did. They needed something that resonated with their discipline, and they found Mithras on the Parthian borders. Mithras was originally a minor light under the great Persian prophet Zarathustra, but he becomes the carrier of Ahura Mazda's light after the Persian state sort of consolidated and extinguished the original vibrant fire.
The soldiers carry him across the empire.
He merges with Osiris, and those who celebrate with him, they acquire the fire with which to bring the new dawn. And this fire is Zarathustrian. It's a cleansing fire. It's not just meant to destroy, but to consume the fourth beast entirely. to purify the ground for new life, not just replace the current structure with a new one.
It's the spiritual version of that stolen fire burning inside the Leviathan's entrails.
Precisely. And now we can look at the resistance movement in Judea, the one that will eventually be symbolized by Jesse, or Joshua, the carpenter's son. This movement specifically understood and avoided the traps of previous traditions.
What traps?
Particularly the political and religious consolidation that happened after the return from Babylon. After the exile, Ezra and his followers, they were empowered by the Persian state. They imposed the law. They became judges and priests. They created a new, rigid, intolerant Leviathan on the people.
So how did the new Judean resistance avoid that trap?
By shifting the entire focus of authority away from the state, away from the external temple, instead of a command like, follow me or submit to the law.
The message was what?
The message of the carpenter's son was radical self-liberation. The kingdom of God is within you. Liberation starts inside. With casting off the repressive armor, both external and internal, he focused on liberating the soul, which meant he wasn't cloaked in any state mantle.
And the symbolism, again, connects back to the Earth Mother.
It does. The core symbol is the crucified sun rising like vegetation like Osiris, like Persephone, offering redemption through death and renewal. And this fundamentally contradicts that earlier state-supporting command from Genesis.
Have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the fowl of the air.
Right. The sources argue that command was interpreted as a call for the sacrifice of the living natural world to Leviathan, to the artificial man. The resistors called for war against the life-hating Leviathan by affirming the sacredness of the whole ecosystem.
And the final, practical, and most lethal weapon against the Leviathan was sharing.
Yes. The sources quote the core principle of this new liberated community. Neither said any of them that aught of the things which he possessed was his own, but they had all things in common.
Okay, let's make this economic point really clear for you listening. Why is sharing so antithetical to Leviathan's existence? Why does sharing destroy the state?
Because the state, especially Rome, it relies entirely on the abstraction and enforcement of private property rights. The ancient legalist Sheng Yang knew this. The state cannot exist if its people do not recognize and abide by state-defined private property.
Everything depends on it.
Everything. Taxation, conscription, legal control over resources, generational wealth. It all relies on the state recognizing, defining, and protecting private holdings that it can then appropriate, regulate, and tax.
So when the community just reclaims common ownership, they're starving the machine. They're denying it access to the very abstractions it needs to function.
They're operating on a completely different network. They're making the tax collector and the bureaucrat irrelevant.
The history we learn in school.
Yeah.
This linear story of empires, Babylon to Persia to Rome. The sources call that his story.
Yeah.
And the joyful realization of the resistors is that the kingdom of heaven is the end of his story, the end of Leviathanic time. They're not waiting for some future dawn. They're already dancing. They're recovering the lost community before the last day.
Their joy comes from knowing that its end Leviathans is at hand, not their own. They've already stepped into a reality defined by bound freedom.
So the sources now shift from this internal chaos of withdrawal to the measurable structural decay of the state itself. What was the effect of this mass decoupling?
Well, the Roman worm, the empire, it just lost all internal coherence. The innards, the people, the life force, they became detached from the shell. The state apparatus, the bureaucracy, the monuments.
And the sources have a really vivid description for this.
They do. The shell became a loose, funnel-shaped carcass spread over the world, keeping out sunlight and fresh air. It's just this immense, inert, dead weight. It's still capable of destruction, but it can't renew itself. Can't grow or assimilate anymore. It's running on pure institutional inertia.
And this decomposition creates this feedback loop of paranoia at the very top.
Instantly. The moment the connection between the head and the body gets weak, the head becomes terrified of the body. We see this manifested in the sheer absurdity of state protection.
The Praetorian Guard.
The sources cite the need for 9,000 Praetorian Guards. Not to protect Rome from barbarians, but to protect the emperor from the empire.
Wow.
Think about the massive resource strain just to fund that level of paranoia. The head is so disconnected from the body it claims to rule that it treats its own people as this immediate, hostile threat.
And this disconnection leads directly to the madness of the rulers, which the sources argue is not an accident. It's the necessary philosophical conclusion of artificial freedom.
Right. The artificial freedom of the Roman emperor. It's the ultimate test case for unbound power. It's arbitrary, absolute power, divorced from all constraints, nature, reason, even his own character.
The text says,
The Roman emperor is constrained by no bounds whatever, not even the bounds of his own character. He can be totally arbitrary.
so people like Caligula and Nero, they're not aberrations. They're the logical endpoint of this whole philosophical line.
They are the inevitable conclusion. If you're constrained by nothing, no God, no law, no tradition, no fear of consequence, then your behavior is free to become completely irrational and destructive. They saw it through to the end.
The loosened head of Leviathan is free to do whatever it wants.
However unnatural, inhuman, or irrational. Let's just use Nero's actions as the case study here for a mind unconstrained by bound freedom.
His career's a roadmap of this decay.
It is. He's freed from all accountability. He murders his own mother, Agrippina, because she's an inconvenience to his absolute self-definition. He deifies his dead mistress, Poppaea, showing he can just arbitrarily define reality itself.
He can kill with a turn of his wrist. But the most revealing act,
The Great Fire of Rome, the ultimate expression of arbitrary power, destroying the very source of your own power.
it's the horrifying culmination.
He can experience the joy of the resistors by setting fire to Rome and watching it burn, proving his total disconnect from the material and human reality of his own state. He's flying free above nature and humanity. He has nothing left to share but doom. The central mechanism of the Leviathan, the emperor's mind, has self-destructed because it ran out of living constraint.
And yet, this entire period of decomposition, from Augustus right through the so-called five good emperors, is the exact time that later historians praise as Rome's peak.
This is the great delusion we have to confront. The praise for this period is just bizarre. Edward Gibbon, writing centuries later, he focuses on the time between the 12th and 17th emperor and calls it mankind's most happy and prosperous period.
Yeah, and Rostovtsev.
Michael Rostovtsev's praised the comfort and the beautiful buildings.
So why? Why were they praising a system that was so clearly dying from the inside?
It reveals exactly what they were looking at. They were looking at the empty shell, the metrics that the state itself produced. Gibbon and Rostovtsev, they were focused on quantifiable things: the size of the army, the stability of the bureaucracy, the architectural remains, the comfort of the urban elite.
When Rostovtsev talks about beautiful buildings, he's confirming he was just looking at the aesthetic apparatus, the disconnected armor, not the suffering, withdrawing life force underneath.
They were judging the health of the machine by the shine on its armor. At the exact moment its internal decomposition was going into high gear, hastened by that internal withdrawal, they mistook mechanical efficiency for vitality.
And eventually that shell did start to crack from external pressure.
It did, aided by outsiders. Nerva's successor, Trajan, he faced these increasing waves of pastoral nomads, Sarmatians, Alamers who were being pushed west by Chinese military actions under Pan Chao in the Tarim Basin.
And the Leviathan couldn't do what it used to do. It couldn't absorb and assimilate new populations for labor and taxes.
Assimilation requires a functioning internal system. But the Roman populace was already checked out. The machine was full and inert.
So Trajan's response was desperate.
It was genocidal. He resorted to genocidal war, exterminating and repopulating Dacia. This was not a healthy expansion. This was a visible sign of failure. Rome was now at war with Eurasia's remaining people because it couldn't reduce them to provincials anymore. It could only destroy them.
And the ultimate sign of this failure to contain life was Hadrian's Wall.
Right. Instead of a defensive boundary, the sources frame it as a psychological self-imprisonment. The wall was meant to keep attackers out, but really it just imprisoned the Roman Empire inside its own decaying shell.
And there's a huge irony in Hadrian's attempts to crush the internal resistance.
A massive irony. He thought he'd won a decisive victory against the Judean resistance. He destroyed Jerusalem, slaughtered the rebels, banned Jews from the Levant. He thought he was crushing that fire of self-liberation for good.
But by dispersing the population, he did the exact opposite.
Precisely. By scattering the Judean resistors, the ones inspired by Jesse, the carpenter's son, he basically launched them on a diaspora to proselytize throughout the entire realm.
So the message of self-liberation and sharing, which had been localized, was now distributed peer-to-peer across the entire map of the Leviathan.
His attempt to crush the resistance only spread the fire of radical community and bound freedom deeper into the empire's entrails. He ensured its final spiritual dissolution.
So let's bring all these threads together now. The sources give us this really clear analogy for how these colossal power structures actually end. And it shows the critical failing point isn't invasion, but internal spiritual starvation.
The master analogy works like this. The empire is a colossal, isolated mainframe computer. It's running old, destructive software. The philosophy of Leviathan. It consumes all the resources, and it only generates abstract commands.
And the people inside, the users, they realize they can't physically escape the building, the geographical empire, so they stop connecting to the central server.
Instead of feeding the center, they start sharing resources and collaborating peer-to-peer. This is the dancing, the radical sharing of goods, the reaffirmation of the Earth Mother. They realize the machine's power only exists when they acknowledge its authority, when they feed its abstractions and respect its definition of private property.
And when they withdraw their life force and form this local decentralized network that's focused on organic life and bound freedom, the mainframe's head, the emperor, just goes insane.
Because it has nothing left to process but its own arbitrary commands, the machine starves itself of the only things it actually needs, compliance and energy.
This clarifies the deeper, non-religious meaning of that rallying cry, "The kingdom of heaven is at hand."
Yeah.
It's not about some vague future reward or a political replacement for Rome.
No, it means the end of his story for the living people. Right here, right now.
It means the spontaneous generation of a living paradise, a local, resilient, decentralized system.
It's a community of free human beings in harmony with Isis and Osiris and all of Cybele's children, plants as well as wolves, birds, and fish as well as insects. It's the restoration of the whole ecosystem, a move from an abstracted political reality back to a natural ecological one.
So the joy we saw in those Nile beggars, it wasn't rooted in future hope, it was rooted in present knowledge.
The joy of the resistors came from knowing not that their end was at hand, but that its Leviathan's end was at hand. They had already stepped into the Golden Age by withdrawing their allegiance and their life force from the machine.
They understood that freedom wasn't some gift granted by the state.
It was a fundamental, immediate characteristic of life, affirmed in community and shared resources.
And the sources give us the ultimate summary of this entire resistance. The one principle that defines that fire in the entrails and the mechanism of its success. This is the quote that, for you, the listener, you need to carry with you. To understand the inherent weakness of any abstracted, centralized power structure, sharing is the heart of the lost community. It is antithetical to Leviathan's very existence.
So we've completed a deep dive into a really radical reading of Roman history. One that reframes collapse not as an event defined by external conflict, but by internal choice.
A choice.
A choice. We've seen that the fire revolution can be internalized. It can be a collective withdrawal, melting the state from within through the affirmation of life, of nature, of community.
And the lesson here seems to be that the moment we collectively prioritize the natural, living world Isis, Cybele, and the principles of radical sharing over the colossal monuments and abstract demands of the state machine,
the machine begins to lose its ability to impose its reality. The shell might stay standing for centuries, but the life force is already somewhere else, building a new, decentralized world.
Which raises an important question for all of us today. We live in a world defined by ever-growing institutions and technological centralization. If the decomposition of the Roman Empire, a period of dissolving central authority and a return to local, organic life, was considered by some famous historians to be mankind's most happy and prosperous period, what modern cultural structures, institutions, or monuments are we currently celebrating as progress? What are our beautiful buildings, our seamless technological abstractions, our comforting metrics of efficiency? That might be nothing more than the rapidly cooling, disconnected shells of our own Leviathans. What abominations are we trained to think are beautiful? Something to chew on, something to explore on your own.